Just a moment. Okay, well, I want to be the first to welcome you and thank you for attending tonight's installment of the Dutchess Land Conservancy's Earth Matters webinar series. My name is Brian Sternidi, and I'm the Outreach and Preserve Manager with the Dutchess Land Conservancy. Tonight, we're thrilled to welcome our own Dutchess County Historian, Will Tatum, as he discusses the palimpsest of land use. Before we get started, my role tonight is to go over the basic logistics about this webinar. After that, our Education Director, Julie Hart, will provide a brief introduction to the Dutchess Land Conservancy and tonight's presenter. So first off, you are muted and chat is disabled for this event to ensure that there is no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled. If you have any questions, you're welcome to enter them in the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. You can access the Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen. The questions you submit will be addressed when the presentation is done or by our team during the presentation if possible. And also, if there are a great deal of questions, we'll try to combine them based on topics. Third, closed captioning is enabled for this event. To turn this function on, please select the CC icon located at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I'd like to hand it over to Julie Hart, our Education Director, who will tell you a bit about the Dutchess Land Conservancy, this webinar series, and our guest presenter tonight. Julie.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Dutchess Land Conservancy. I think many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, let me just give you a quick overview. The Dutchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're dedicated to preserving the farms and forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we've worked with hundreds of landowners and protected over 46,000 acres of land. And we want to thank our sponsors for this evening's webinar, the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund, Labella Associates, and Mutual of America. So this is our third season of Earth Matters, our winter webinar series, and tonight is our next to last webinar for the season. Every month since November and going until April, we've brought you a fascinating speaker with a lot to teach us, all focused on the theme of the history and ecology of our own Hudson Valley. I hope that these webinars are helping you to see the lands around you in a new way, to read the stories that can be found in the rocks, the waters, and the trees, and to find a new appreciation for this incredible landscape that we call home. Tonight, I am so excited to welcome Will Tatum, our Dutchess County historian. Will has served as Dutchess County historian since 2012, and his duties include designing exhibits, conducting archival projects, and presenting public programming, such as our webinar tonight. He also coordinates our county's history community, which includes local historians and historical societies, and I'm glad to see that many of you are tuning in tonight, as well as preservation groups and the state and federal historic sites. Will has published and presented on wide-ranging topics, including business history, the development of the municipal landscape, crime in the courts, and poor relief. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you, Will, to tell us about the palimpsest of land use, reading the landscape as a historical source.
All right, thank you very much, Julie. Welcome everyone this evening. Thank you for tuning in. We're about to see if I can make it over the first hurdle, which is to get the PowerPoint shared. So I'm going to look to Julie for a thumbs up. All right, I see a thumbs up from Brian. Excellent. So you should all be looking at the title slide there, Palimpsest of Land Use, Reading the Landscape as a Historical Source. And you've got three components there that we will be touching on this evening. But just as some introductory remarks, first, I should throw in out there that I am not a professional landscape historian. The history of landscapes is its own brand of the history discipline. It goes back to England in the 1950s when a guy named W.G. Hoskins wrote The Making of the English Landscape, and then a series of books thereafter, talking about this concept that the sort of a combination of history and archaeology, the landscape itself is a historical source because the shape of the landscape, how we interact with it today, what we see on it today, is a reflection of historical processes of human use that have, and also non-use, that have developed over the past centuries. Of course, in England, they are talking about thousands to tens of thousands of years of human occupation. Here in the Hudson Valley, we're talking, and specifically tonight, we're talking about more or less 300 years of European occupation here in the county of Dutchess. And a lot of these things we'll be talking about, these ideas, are transferable. But I always have to point out that this is a topic that has a lot of local peculiarities to it. There are no two places in Dutchess County, almost practically no 2 square feet in Dutchess County that are the same thing. So tonight is not going to be a how-to for landscape history. It's going to be more of a meditation on landscape history, specifically here in Dutchess County. But as the result of it being a meditation, I'm not going to try to cover every single aspect of landscape history and land use here in Dutchess County. You will notice that there are some things I leave out. One of the more glaring points will be the railroad. It did happen, but the railroad has its own very energetic group of historians. I do not want to encroach on their territory. You will not see a whole lot of detailed consideration of the variety of industrial activities, especially in Western Dutchess, which ran the gamut from making heavy machinery to making clothing to making bricks, a whole lot of stuff going on. But I will instead be focusing on general concepts of activities that have shaped the face of the landscape over time and how we can understand this larger arc of history where our documentation meets what we can see on the historic landscape. So what specifically will we be going over tonight? And of course, I have to give a shout out to the Dutchess County Ancient Documents Project. You see a beautiful doodle there from one of our late 18th, early 19th century documents. It's our flagship program here at the Dutchess County Clerk's Office and Historian's Office of making these sources accessible to you. And much of what we'll be looking at tonight is material drawn from other sources that are available here at 22 Market Street and increasingly online. But in terms of what we're going to be talking about, first, I'm going to block out for you as best I can, because this topic, like many others, is still in its infancy of detailed research. The initial European settlement of Dutchess County, it was not a smooth affair, it was not a simple affair. It's highly complicated, and we still really don't have enough data to make the sort of specific remarks on all aspects of the county that I would be comfortable making. But it nevertheless is something that has to be considered because decisions made very early in Dutchess County's history. And remember that Dutchess County was laid out on a map and established by law in 1683. So 341 years ago, as of this November, decisions made very early on, really in the first, say, 40, 50 years of Dutchess County's administrative institutional existence still impact us today, which of course is why you need a county historian. We'll move from that to talking about the cornerstones of the colonial economy, which established the 2 big themes of land use that continue throughout all of Dutchess County history, more or less up to the most modern period. Those are agriculture and industry, in this case, the kings of wheat and iron. We'll get into those details. Then we'll move on to the post-revolutionary diversification. So after the American Revolution is over, after we are outside of the English imperial system, all bets are off, all imperial regulations are off. We see just a mind-blowing amount of economic expansion, which of course has a lot of impacts on other aspects of land use from right after the revolution, more or less up into the mid-19th century. And then in the mid-19th century, we see the establishment of more or less a version of the historical basis for the classic story of Eastern and Western Dutchess, which is not entirely accurate, but the idea there being that the West is industrial, the East is agricultural. The East is dominated, of course, by dairy, according to the classic stories. The West is dominated by heavy machinery, tool manufacturing, clothing manufacturing, bricks, some of the stuff that I said we're not going to get into in too much detail, but we will be getting into how that does not quite do justice to the realities from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. And then I will conclude today with just a couple of pot shots at what has happened more or less over the past 70 years and where we might be going, because as we move forward in time, and generally I like to cut off my commentary with the Charter of 1967, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. As we move forward in time, especially on this topic, we transition from being a project of the county historian's office to more being a project of county planning. And I do not want to steal any of their fire, especially since they understand all of the ins and outs of modern planning far, far better than I do. So the very beginning, and this is a map, I believe, courtesy of Frank Doherty. I have had it in my files for quite some time, that overlays the colonial patents on more or less the modern municipal boundaries, at least the town boundaries. I do not believe that we have the cities and villages picked out here. But as confusing as this kind of is, it's just a very light version of the actual confusion of the early colonial period here in Dutchess County and really throughout the Hudson Valley. So what happens? How do Europeans enter this landscape and begin to use it and leave their marks upon it? It all more or less begins with the colonial projects of the 17th century and rivalry between the colony of New York, formerly New Amsterdam and New Netherland, and the New England colonies, specifically Connecticut and Massachusetts. There's a bit of a disagreement over where borders ends, which leads to the establishment of the first 12 counties of New York in 1683. But of course, it's one thing to draw lines on a map. It's another thing to actually be able to enforce those lines. The difference being you actually need people on the ground to hold those boundaries. And as we'll see with a few comments shortly, lines on a map do not stop Connecticut and Massachusetts from sending people into territory claimed by New York. But how do you get from a map in a room in New York City to people on the ground? That intermediate step is the process of patenting land. And again, that goes back to 17th century use of language, which is different from ours today. It's why we still have a T in Dutchess. We are not named after the Dutch people. We are named after the Duchess of York, Mary of Modena. And it just so happens that in 1683, the people writing that original document decided that the title Duchess would really be improved by adding a T to it. You know, gratuitous use of additional letters, not necessary, but a mark of coolness. And we will see some of that here this evening with gratuitous use of historical photographs later on. So beginning very shortly after the establishment of these counties, land speculators who were based down in New York City received the green light to go out to do deals with the indigenous people and to start establishing settlement. Is this going to be a straightforward process? Absolutely not. The British Empire does not believe in straightforward any more than we believe in straightforward here in the Empire State today. It's a complicated process that begins, and in our specific case with the Rombout patent in 1685, with a group of investors who go up to Dutchess County. They land, they locate indigenous representatives, they have negotiations with indigenous representatives. They conclude a written agreement for the purchase of the land. And this is a business transaction. We can certainly question how fair and reliable that was from modern perspective, but they were required to actually do paperwork. Again, the roots of modern New York go way back all the way to the beginning. So once the original patentees or their agents conclude this agreement with the indigenous people, it's not over. You've got to bring that back down to New York City and present it to the governor and his council, who are supposed to all look over it and discuss it and decide whether or not it seems legit. In reality, it seems like one person, the secretary of the council, probably fulfills that requirement, especially as we move forward in time. Once the royal governor and his council feel that this is okay, this is legitimate, guys have actually gone up there and met with the indigenous people, they didn't just sit in a pub drinking gin and make it all up. That paperwork is sent across the Atlantic Ocean to today's Greater London metropolitan area, back then the city of Whitehall, where the Board of Trade takes a look at it. In the 17th century and for much of the 18th century, the Board of Trade actually administers the colonies. And these are basically lords and high-ranking merchants with mercantile interests throughout the empire. They look over the paperwork. If they decide that it looks good, they send it to the crown. And someone in the king's administration looks it over. If they think it's okay, they administer the royal signature to it, and then they send it back to the Board of Trade, which again looks it over to make sure all the signatures are done properly. They send it back to New York City, at which point the governor and council issue a patent, an actual deed document to the patentees that says, all right, you now have the pleasure of claiming this lot of 20,000 acres of land. And this is basically where initially the government's interest ends, because the fine print of this is not just, great, you have title to this land. It is great, you have title to this land. And now you can pay us taxes on it, taxes called quit rents. There is, in fact, no permission given with the patent to subdivide it in order to either sell it and make some money off the sale of the land, or to lease these parcels out to tenant farmers and thus make money through rent. That's a completely separate process with its own paperwork that has to be gone through. We do have a couple of original copies of patents still here in Dutchess County. One of them is a copy of the Rombout patent, the very first one from 1685. You can see Thomas Dongan's name up there in the upper corner. He was, in my opinion, still one of the great, if not the greatest, governor of New York, despite the fact that it's from the colonial period and not the state period. But he laid the groundwork for most of what we still do today. All of that goes through basically the metes and boundaries of the land, which are understandably vague. It was a very large lot, but importantly, down at the bottom where you see the print start to get small and cramped, that lays out all of those taxation regulations that, yeah, you're going to have to turn over some stuff to pay rent to the crown every year, quit rent. And this, of course, gets passed down eventually to the folks who become the tenant farmers. The back of this document tells you all about when that quit rent is paid, because when these guys and their descendants and their representatives go down to New York City to pay this rent, they bring this deed with them. And in order to prove that they have paid their taxes, they have all of these endorsements written on the back. I've picked out one for you there, so you can see that this is not necessarily an annual process, because in 1718, the representatives of the heirs of the original patentees are, paying 33 years worth of quit rent in one go. And this, of course, is paid in winter wheat. And we'll get to that because that's our first entree into the land use part of this. So patentees, it's great. You set up this structure through which technically you can use the land, but you have to actually go through another step unless you're going to farm it yourself. And again, these land speculators aren't really keen about leaving the relative comforts of New York City to live in the wilds of Dutchess County, which still has some virgin forest well into the 19th century. So what happens next? Well, the next step is the subdivision of the land. And we actually have some documents here in the clerk's office that talk about the subdivisions that happen at the very last of the patents. That's the Little Nine Partners patent of 1706. And as you can see in the written part of the slide there, it takes more or less 30 years to finally get all of the paperwork through the governor and council and the assembly to enable the partition of this land. They survey it. We'll see that map in just a second. And then they divide up the lots, basically take pieces of paper, write the lot number on it, put it in a hat, get two teenage boys to pull these numbers out of a hat, and you get that list on the left side of your screen there about which of the original 9 partners or their descendants or representatives get which lots. And this is what it ends up looking like, with big thanks to Bill Jeffway for making this markup of a map that is here on file in the county clerk's office. So you roughly see that the Little Nine Partners patent is the modern towns of Milan and Pine Plains. There's a little bit of modern Northeast in there, which of course is its own story entirely. But they divide, they really actually just draw these things on a piece of paper, and then they send out surveyors to plot these boundaries on the land afterwards. This is especially true of the Great Nine Partners patent, which is essentially the entire middle section of Dutchess County. They rate the parcels in terms of good, indifferent, and bad. They're really looking for agricultural productivity over these lots, but they also mentioned the mineral rights pretty early on. So we're beginning to see, just in the laying out of the parcels of the land for occupation, this developing idea between agriculture and industry that's going to take us through the rest of Dutchess County's history, pretty much almost up to the present. So now we're moving finally into the land use. The land has been laid out. A lot of this settlement is happening decades after these original patents are made, and not all of the patents are successful. There are a whole bunch of failed attempts to do patents, including a couple of patents that probably should have failed, but didn't, but then had to be straightened out during the partition portion of settlement in the second and third quarters of the 18th century. But what happens? All right, you're the patentee. You've got the land subdivided. What do you want on this land? You want tenant farmers, because what is the cash crop of 18th century and 17th century New York, what you're really going to be paying your rent in and your taxes in to the British Crown, at least, that's going to be good merchantable winter wheat. We have really the earliest document in the ancient documents collection. It's from a later case, but this is a rental agreement. And if you're looking at that and thinking, wow, I either need a better glasses prescription or the handwriting was really bad back then, that is written in Dutch. It's not you, it's the 1720s. But this is a rental agreement between Madame Brett, so Katharina Brett, the major female force in southern Dutchess during the 18th century, and one of her tenant farmers, Jacob Mazier. And it lays out in there how many shekels, which is the Dutch equivalent of bushels of wheat, will be paid to Madame Brett every year. And we have this bond, this agreement, because Jacob Mazier falls behind on his payments, and so Madame Brett takes him to court. So that is where the court records that we've been working on for the past 10, 11 years actually come in handy for understanding land use, amongst a bunch of other amazing stories here and there. And we'll see a little bit about the industrial side. So really, what the patentees are looking for, what they are encouraging across the entirety of Dutchess County, we want people to come in and grow wheat and give some of it to us, because that's how things work. The British Empire, from really before the takeover of New Netherlands, is not interested in their colonies having hard currency. They really aren't even fans of paper currency, but gold, silver, copper, because if you have gold, silver, copper, that means you can buy from the Dutch, the Spanish, the French. It's not how imperial systems are supposed to work. You're supposed to be generating raw materials, and a great raw material to have is wheat, because it's transportable. You can also make it into beautiful things like beer that's even easier to preserve and transport. But that's what they want, is wheat. So how do we begin to extract this? Well, we don't really know what's going on and what the very earliest farms in Dutchess County look like, because again, our documentation and its survival starts to pick up in the mid-18th century. One example that tells us how these early settlements and the boundaries of land use are laid out comes from Rhinebeck. This map was made in 1802, but the notations, and you can see some red markings on the detail there that says September 1774. The notations on this map talk about when these original lease arrangements began. We presume, for lack of any other evidence, that the boundaries marked on these maps are correct. But this goes back to Henry Beekman, and these are not the famous Palatines that come down to Beekman in 1712. These are cousins, aunts, uncles, nephews, other folks, some of whom come directly to the Hudson Valley after the initial 1709, 1710 arrivals, or they come up via the port of Philadelphia, and they settle what is still today Württemberg Road and the hamlet of Württemberg in Rhinebeck. Of course, they call it Wittenberg back then, because if there's an opportunity to make things confusing, people in the past will do that. They just enjoy doing that sort of thing. What we see here is a primarily agricultural community, and it's laid out in a fashion that is not typical for English and Dutch. That's one of the reasons we know this is German. The other, of course, being the names that we can track back. But what you'll see there on the, and this itself is a detail of this map, which is huge. But Württemberg is laid out linearly along a road with a church and a school at the center and all of these agricultural lots around it. They are not uniform size. You can see where some of the surveyors have had fun drawing straight lines, but you can also see where terrain features have totally messed up any plan to have uniform, regular lots. What you can also see here, and it's especially important in this blown up detail in front of you, is we begin to see not only the layout of fields, but also some indication of structures that are part of an 18th century farm. And across this map, we see the same pattern repeated over and over again. We have a residence and a barn. So residence, of course, because you need some place to live. Barn, you need some place to store equipment, potentially to store wheat. We aren't expecting them to show every single structure that's on the ground at this point, but this begins to give us an idea for interpreting the modern landscape and as a historical source to think about, this is what we see now. What might that indicate have existed centuries ago? So that is our earliest view of what land use looked like in an agricultural sense here in Dutchess County. But if you cross the Taconics and you go into Eastern Dutchess, you pretty quickly find that the land is a bit more variable on the east side of the Taconics than on the west side. And it's just not, you don't have the same amount of arable land out there that you do here in Western Dutchess. There's a reason why Western Dutchess becomes, for example, the breadbasket of the revolution. I put that in quotation marks, but there's a lot of evidence to back that up. And Eastern Dutchess becomes basically the arms house of the revolution. Because yes, when you are out there in Eastern Dutchess and you are a patentee, you are doing your best to encourage your tenants to be people who grow wheat, because that's what you want to be paid in. That's what you pay your quit rents to the crown in. But if you can't get wheat and you've got iron deposits, which are all over the place in Eastern Dutchess at the time and still today, well, you know, you're not going to cut off your nose to spite your face. You're going to go into business mining and, to the best of your abilities, refining iron. So you have on the left side there a picture of an iron furnace. This is a 19th century iron furnace, not an 18th century one. We more or less know where they were, but they were knocked down in the past, sometimes to build other structures, sometimes to build better, newer model furnaces. But on the right, we have yet another document from the Ancient Documents collection, documenting that by 1751, down in Dover, which is, of course, locally famous for its furnaces, they had furnaces in operation that could refine at least a ton of good usable iron at a time. And that people in Poughkeepsie were aware of this and were paying folks in Dover to send this iron to Poughkeepsie and then suing them in the Dutchess County courts here in Poughkeepsie, next door to where I am tonight, when that iron didn't show up. So we owe Mr. Berry and Mr. Boyce a very great debt of gratitude for, in fact, not having delivered their promise and giving us this documentation for early industrial activity. But of course, we have other evidence as well, especially coming out of Armenia, because we have the steelworks in Wassaic. Now, this is technically south of Wassaic today. They were clearly not too particular when they were doing this postcard back around the turn of the 20th century. But the steelworks is in operation around the mid-18th century. They're taking that iron, they are turning it into steel, and by the time the American Revolution comes around, they are using that steel to make things like muskets, swords, bayonets, all of those arms that are necessary to secure American freedom and liberty and independence, which sets us up for the next part. And unfortunately, we do not have any images of what the steel yard or the steel works would have looked like during their period of primary use. So that sets us up for what happens after the revolution. So again, colonial period, we have wheat. That is A plus number one. If you can't get wheat, you're going to go for iron. But to make iron actually sellable and useful, you're going to have to refine iron, which you're not supposed to do under British imperial regulations. And even worse, you're going to make things out of that iron. You know, the fancy stuff that gets made out of it is weapons of war for the revolution, but a lot of agricultural implements are also made locally, which is even worse than making weapons for the rebels. because during the colonial period, of course, you're supposed to send that just barely refined enough so that we can put it on a boat and sail it to England, iron over there, and then you're supposed to buy all of your scythes and your sickles and everything else from England. That's how the empire is supposed to work. You're not supposed to be setting up blacksmith shops and Armenia and Pine Plains and making that stuff locally. Very much defeats the point of the system. But now we're in 1790. It is after the war, and we get this. So this is a beautiful map of Beekman. It is part of a series of maps that were made in 1797, 1798 because of new taxation regulations coming in, yes, that required this. And just to give us a detail, I know the folks that we see down here on the corner are super cool, but to get to the point of what this tells us and why it's important, we need to zoom in a bit. So throughout the Revolutionary period, things have been pretty darn basic here in Dutchess County. Yes, in addition to making farms and iron mines and iron foundries and steelworks and blacksmith shops, you do have to make roads to connect all of these things. But these roads, even what is today modern Route 9, the Post Road, are pretty basic affairs. Following the end of the Revolution, there's a huge boom in road building, things like Route 22, but especially Route 44, Route 55, Route 199 today. Those come out of this post-revolutionary economic boom because you're no longer held back by the British imperial system. You can make things, you can sell things, you can access other markets, but you have to be able to bring those goods to market. So road networks spring up all over the place, many of which are still in use today. So as you are driving around Dutchess County, going from here to there, think about how that road runs, because that is an important aspect of land use, is how we use it for transportation, not just how we use it to either extract or produce resources. And as you can see here, you've got a couple of great creeks that are used for transportation, Sprout Creek and Clove Creek. You've got roads all over the place. And if you were to really super duper zoom in, you would see that in addition to houses, for folks like Preserved Fish, one of my personal favorites out of there, and taverns and stores and churches, you also have mills that are beginning to pop up. This is when industrialization begins to take off here in Dutchess County. But before we get to that, I do have a little bit of a bias, you may notice throughout this presentation, for farms. So how does farming change beginning in the 1790s? Well, a couple of things happen. First of all, you don't have to pay quit rents to the crown anymore. Huzzah, wonderful, excellent. You do still have to pay taxes and you have to pay rent. But increasingly, those taxes and rent, the landlords and especially the government want that to be paid in hard specie. The government especially does not want to have to figure out how to make X amount of dollars from X amount of bushels of good merchantable winter wheat. It's just too complicated, not enough people to handle that. So what do? Well, one of the first things that happens, and this is more of a county clerk thing than a land use thing, is that the state of New York does its best to break the system of rents. So there is a lot of pressure put on landlords during this period to say, hey, you don't need to own 36 farms, John Armstrong Jr. You can maybe satisfy yourself with just 17 farms, and all of the rest, maybe you want to transfer from renthold to freehold. Now, you can still require people to pay you money. It's kind of like a mortgage, but we're not going to get into the details of that because they're very sticky. But there's a growth in freehold. So that creates all these opportunities for folks to diversify because they no longer have to worry about growing X amount of bushels of winter wheat to pay the boss. The other thing, of course, that allows them to grow is the imperial system's gone. There are all these opportunities to delve into other things. Some of those things are, as you can see reflected on this plat map, apples. Apples are a thing in colonial Dutchess, but by the time of the 1790s, early 19th century, basically every farm is going to have, in addition to its standard building apparatus of the actual residence, the barn, the wheat barracks, where you actually keep the wheat, not the soldiers, and Star Barrack Road up in Red Hook is actually named after a barracks to hold wheat or hay not to hold soldiers. You're going to have orchards. You're also going to have dairies. Most of the advertisements for sales of farms in this day and age are all about, you see dairies across this entire place. You also have sheep cultivation and wool, which leads us to industry. But before we get to industry, we also have planned communities, this being what is today the village of Red Hook, because as all of these roads are springing up, you have opportunities to create new housing, new actually mixed housing and retail locations. So if you have a big plot of land that you don't really want to bother having to farm, and it just happens to be at a place where the New York Stagecoach Corporation is going to be dropping some new stagecoach stops, you might just want to step in there because you've gotten a little bit of advance notice, have everything surveyed out for you, and then have all of these plots ready to sell off to either householders or shop owners. So when we are thinking about, again, that transportation part of it and looking forward to some things that are happening today, planned communities, nothing new, very old in Dutchess County. But I mentioned industry. So you've got the sheep and you have the wool. And of course, you have a demand to build all of these buildings that are going to be part of your new planned communities. You have mills and you have factories that pop up all over the place. So if you look at what is today Tivoli, you'll see a woolen mill, you'll see a grist mill, you'll see a sawmill. This stuff pops up all over the place. It even pops up in places you might not expect it, such as today the hamlet, but at one time the village of Burbank, which is known for its woolen manufactory. They are taking raw wool from local farmers and they are spinning it into all, and not like spinning with a little spinning wheel at home. This is major, serious machinery, water powered. They're making all sorts of complicated cloth with it. Broadcloth, which is a very fine, like high class, high status cloth. It's what you get your formal wear made from, all the way down to flannel, things that workmen would wear on an everyday basis. So massive expansion across Dutchess County in factories and making stuff. But what's happening now out in Eastern Dutchess as we move into the middle of the 19th century? All right, agriculture and industry. Now we're getting to the point where classically we say Western Dutchess, 100% industry. That's all they do. Eastern Dutchess is the land of dairy. It's the land of board and milk. Even though he starts his experiments on the other side of the river, he comes to Wassaic. He sets up the board and milk factory. The railroad magically appears, and Dutchess County becomes the #1 supplier to both sides in the Civil War of condensed milk, because this is its arguable birthplace. By the way, that whole milk thing is not just confined to Wassaic. You see it up in Millerton, the Northeast. And thank you, Ed Downey, for giving me this beautiful image, which I surreptitiously stole. But, you know, you've got the courtesy down there. So when we talk about agriculture in the Eastern Dutchess, yes, it is a lot of cows. It's a lot of milk. But there is an industrial component. So we start to see the breakdown of this whole, the West is industrial, the East is agricultural, because the East is agri-industry. You've got to take the milk from the cows and make it into something that can be shipped around the world. But what comes before the milk is our old friend iron. So these are the Wassaic kilns circa 2016. Now, Wassaic becomes the location of a major iron industry, a major iron foundry there. Iron foundries at this point in time, we're talking the mid-19th century, run off charcoal. That's how they get the raw iron hot enough to melt down and to begin refining. So that's the Wassaic Iron Kilns in 2016. This is them today, with a big thanks to the town of Amenia and the private landowner who has transferred, I believe, the property to the town of Amenia now and created a park. Yes, there used to be 3 of these many, many, many moons ago, but now we have 2 of the best preserved. I'm just going to go out there and say it because I am a Dutchess County booster, probably in the Hudson Valley, maybe in the Northeast. Someone else is going to have to send me photos even better than this of other charcoal kilns. I do not have photos of the Gridley ironwork, sadly, that these supplied. But iron is huge in Eastern Dutchess. There are all sorts of furnaces built all up and down Eastern Dutchess, there are mining operations. And what do those look like? Well, by the early 20th century, they look like this. Not so pretty, very important for the local economy and, in fact, the county-wide economy. But still, land use, it's not all just cows or farming or building Hudson River fringe factories. You've got a lot of stuff that is heavy industry happening in Eastern Dutchess and happening right up through the first decades of the 19th century, the 20th century, before it starts to move down to places like Pennsylvania because of small details like the Bessemer process and science. You know, it catches up with us at some point. Now, of course, transportation has been improving throughout this period. You have a lot of private roads that are being built, and that's one way to get roads out there that does not overtax the taxpayers. This is an example of early 20th century, a toll gate still in operation down in Pawling. We love these old photographs and postcards for this purpose. And just think, you know, this is not a secondary road, even though it looks kind of small for us today. This is the shape of infrastructure, that land use of transportation in Dutchess County. Now we start to get into the gratuitous use of what I think at least are cool historical photos. These come from Stanfordville. This is a major road. This is a parade for supporting World War I in 1918. This is the road you go to get to the train depot. Yes, see, train aficionados, I did mention the railroad, but briefly I will leave the larger story of the railroad to all of you. So at the same time that we have serious heavy industry in Western Dutchess and Eastern Dutchess, and we have agriculture, our transportation network, yeah, it's better than the 18th century. These roads are better maintained. They're often metalled, what we today would call a gravel road, but it's still a little on the basic side. There's a lot of side-by-side survival of old technologies along with new technologies, which means that the landscape itself does change over time from, say, 1850 to 1950, but there's also a pretty significant amount of continuity and all of that, which is why there's still so many old farm structures and industrial remnants, if you know where to look for them, still here today. The cities are not a great place to look for them, but if you go down to the village of Wappingers Falls, you will see a lot from the bleachery, which of course was big into the cloth and clothing manufacturing. But we looked at Beekman for a little bit of side by side. All right, 1940, two photos from 1940. This is the first. Yeah, the discs on those plows are super duper modern, but use of horse teams to plow the land for cultivation goes all the way back to the colonial period. But same decade, we've got trucks and tractors out actually doing the mowing and gathering the hay. So now we're transferring to the concluding part of our presentation tonight, and that's looking at how do these processes still survive a bit on the landscape today? Where can you see them and where can you not? And where do I sort of get the throwaway line of the conclusion that we're becoming suburbia? So this is the Fulton Homestead. I chose it in large part because it is not too far away from where I live in northern Dutchess, and it is a very well preserved rural landscape in terms of the level of preservation that you see today, reading the landscape as a source. As you can see there with the historical marker, this goes back to that 1790s era. If you look at the view here below it, you can see you still have the main house, you still have the assemblage of barns, because as agriculture diversified, the number of structures required to support the diversification of activities increases. You have your stone walls, the things we all love to look at, talk about, think about, wonder why there are so many of them and why their shapes are so weird. You've got much of the kit and caboodle there. You might be tempted to say, wow, this is wonderfully preserved, 100%, maybe 95%. And especially when you take a look, and that's modern Route 199 along the left of this, you've got an enclosure, which in my opinion is pretty clearly for holding some form of livestock. We won't mention why they would put them in a pen for a brief amount of time before doing something else with them. There might be children watching tonight who don't know where their groceries come from. But this looks very, very good. 100%, maybe yes, probably more like no. So we go to another aspect of Dutchess County's records management and records access, parcel access. which gives us aerial views. If you go to a specific property, you will be able to look at it over time. So this is that Fulton homestead, still a huge swath of land, potentially at least a significant portion of the original farm. Now, through the aerial views, we can take that back to 1936. That's as far back as our aerial views go. And it's the best sort of modern evidence we have for what the landscape looked like. So we look at today on the left, we look at today on the right, and suddenly that idea of, wow, we have 100% preservation of a 19th century farm, late 18th century farm. Well, but do you? Because on the side there, 1936, you can still see those stone walls that are setting out field boundaries. And you can also see that modern Turkey Hill, and I misspoke earlier when I said 199, it's Turkey Hill Road. Modern Turkey Hill Road does not exist. You see the old line of the road that goes by the Fulton homestead and then shoots up to properties that are further east of that. So give or take, basically 100 years ago, it's in a much different situation and context than it is today, because it is still being farmed at that point in time. If we want to zoom detail in here, we can see that the process of landscape transformation, the loss of the older elements of the landscape, proceeds pretty quickly. 1936, not a whole lot of trees, lots of very clear stone boundaries. 1955, we can begin seeing signs of reforestation. So this is no longer being plowed, being farmed. We fast forward to 1980, and we're basically at the modern status of the landscape. So this reforestation and changes in the landscape, because both of use, but also the cessation of use of landscapes, is a major consideration when we think about landscapes as a historical source. So, but this is still an example of pretty much as good a level of preservation as you can expect to see in Dutchess County and through most of the Hudson Valley. It's just been left alone because it's pretty far out there, which is exactly where I like to be. But now we hit our conclusion, the rise of suburbia and the commuter state. So when I'm forced to comment on things within a period that is really not so much history as it is planning, I look at how we have changed from land use as an economic engine in terms of extracting resources from the land, either things that we grow on the land or things we dig out of it, to using it as really more of a place to live, where economic activity becomes concentrated in specific purpose-built areas, and everything else becomes where those people are going to live who do those activities. And of course, international business machines, IBM, kicks that off hard when they come into town in 1944, and then subsequently become a major powerhouse of employment here in Dutchess County, and begin to bring in more and more people, which causes actually the change to charter government. But it also causes this change from using the landscape as a form of economic engine to using it primarily for housing. And the example that I'm going to end with tonight is the Frank Brothers farm out on Route 44. Used to be a major dairy operation, but even here in 1940, which is our earliest, clearest aerial, you can see that the process of translating this area from an economic engine in terms of agricultural use to residential space is already pretty well underway. And this is what it looks like today. It is home to the Eastdale Village development. And Dutchess County Planning actually called this back in the 1950s. They have a series of maps made in the 1950s that were predictive models to say, all right, where are we going to see this transformation of agricultural and old industrial landscapes into residential landscapes? And from what I'm told, those models are pretty much spot on. So that brings us to the end of my meditations on land use history. The big takeaways are, when you're looking back at land use history and what you're going to see signs of today, it's going to be a mix of agricultural and industrial, and that goes throughout the county. There's no one area that is exclusively agricultural, no one area that is exclusively industrial. Industry runs the gamut from making clay bricks to heavy iron refinements and creation of iron and steel-based stuff for sale. It's a complicated story with a heck of a lot of fine-grained detail on the local level. So at this point, I'm going to throw things back over to Julie and Brian, and we will see what sorts of questions we have that I might be able to address. So thank you all for your time tonight.
Thank you, Will. That was so interesting. What an interesting take on the landscape, and to cover so much history in such a short amount of time. So just so everyone knows, we'll be sending out a follow-up email that'll include a list of resources, the links to some of the websites that Will was talking about, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar. Before we begin the Q&A, I want to let everybody know that next month on Wednesday, April 3rd, that's our last Earth Matters webinar for this season. And our speaker will be from the Institute of American Indian Studies in Connecticut. The presentation will focus on two-eyed seeing in the Hudson Valley. So that's kind of an interesting concept that I hope you'll be able to tune in for. If you've read Robin Wall Kimmerer's wonderful book, Breeding Sweetgrass, that is a concept that she talks about, the two-eyed seeing idea that Western science and indigenous knowledge can complement each other and each bring a different set of eyes through which we can see and understand the world around us. So we hope that we will see you there. And please go ahead and start typing your questions into Q&A. We've got a couple in there already. So let's start. So the first question is an observation and a question, actually. So this was when you were talking about the patent maps. The comment is, wow, drawing arbitrary lot lines on a piece of paper based on arbitrary rectangular shapes, which I'm glad this question was asked, because I was thinking the exact same thing when you had the map of the Little Nine Partners patent up, because some of those rectangles contain Stissing Mountain, which is a very different type of land than much of the very farmable land in other parts of Pine Plains. But the question is, wondering how patterns of land use of indigenous people influence the patents and the drawing of those boundaries.
Well, one of the reasons I purposefully limited us to the period of European occupation here is because I do not have access to the sort of data that I need to make any sort of statements at all on indigenous land use. It's simply not something I've looked for it. I haven't found it yet. However, from evidence that we hold here in the county clerk's office, including John Sackett's survey book, he was the guy who went out and surveyed, or at least tried to survey, parts of the great Nine Partners patent. That's Central Dutchess, and that's really one of the worst examples of guys just drawing lines on a map, and then they say, John, we need you to actually go up to Dutchess County, find the indigenous people, let them know that we're moving forward with everything. And by the way, do you think you could survey these lots and maybe put some stakes or piles of rocks, or, you know, mark the black elm tree, whatever, that we can use in the future? We have his field book, or at least parts of it, in the ancient documents. And of course, for anyone who's done surveying or worked with surveyors, or hung out with one in a bar, you know that they're just notes and a lot of math in terms of what they've done. But he says over and over again in there, and I'm going to paraphrase his language, you know, looked for indigenous people, did not find them, day after day after day after day. So for as far, and I like to keep my comments as much as I can confined by the documentable past, where I have evidence from the past to back them up. As far as we can tell, indigenous practices, indigenous land use, indigenous settlement patterns had absolutely nothing to do with these boundary lines. And some of the stories, especially of the Rombout patent, where technically they figured out what that was going to look like by going on top of Mount Beacon and pointing. I mean, it sounds terrible and scandalous and couldn't possibly be true. I'm pretty convinced it actually is true. So no role of indigenous people in terms of laying out of these initial patents or indeed of their subdivisions.
Clearly, arbitrary lines that mean something to one person and nothing to another. Well, thank you for that diplomatic answer. We'll appreciate that. The next question is a lot lighter and more straightforward to answer, I believe. Where is or was the toll gate in Pauling?
I do not know. This is a postcard that I ran across, and you don't often find postcard views of the toll roads, largely, I think, because David Turner has already snapped up all of the great ones. He has an absolutely outstanding collection that he's very generous in sharing, but I don't know exactly where this would have been in Pauling.
Okay, and the next question, kind of in the same vein, this is referring to that iron furnace. Is that open to the public?
I believe that that iron furnace is not open to the public. I would have to defer to my colleagues out in Dover, but I believe that that is now part of a private development.
Yeah, I think that's correct. It's off of Dover Furnace Road, as I
Which
recall, but not
which was where the furnaces have
Mhm.
been since the 1750s, not all in the
Right.
same place, of course. And the one that the guys got smacked down for in court for not delivering what they had
Mhm.
been promised to was somewhere out there. I don't think any of the remains are visible. But if
Okay.
you do want to see a pile of rocks that was one time a furnace, you can go to Time War Park and hike to the far end of the pond
Oh,
there.
good to know.
Cool advice. Thank you. The next question I feel like could be the question of the night and the question that might be on a lot of landowning individuals' minds. If I wanted to find out more information about my own property, whom do I contact? This individual lives in Burbank and their house dates from 1780, so understandably so that they might want to understand a bit more about the history of their house. And I think a lot of other folks would like to as well.
Well, house histories are one of the two most complicated sorts of research to conduct in local history because you're drawing, first of all, you're drawing from a series of document types, which we have here at the county clerk's office, but which they aren't what historians normally use, and they never tell you what you want to know. Because as far as people in the past went, all they really cared about were the metes and bounds of their property. So when, for example, you do deed searches, a title search, as it's currently known in modern practice, that's only going to tell you about the boundaries of the property. It's not going to tell you about when the house was built that was on there, what activities might have happened there, any of the sorts of things that we really want to know as property owners, the cool stuff. And there currently is not anyone really doing this research because it is so intensive. But you can always come down to 22 Market Street, take a look at our deed records here, which County Clerk Brad Kendall is in the process of digitizing so that those will be available online. Parcel access is a great place to start. You've seen some of the images that come out of that, and because of the great work of both our Office of Central and Information Services, Planning, Real Property, a significant number of different groups and divisions coming together, parcel access now has the full GIS suite hooked into it. So when you look up your parcel, and if you go down to the lower right-hand side of your screen, you can see a link to look at the historic aerials, which is what I did for part of tonight's presentation. And you can take that back to 1936 and see, hey, were there a bunch of stone walls or something else at that point in time that are no longer here? There's also a link to the Historical Resources Survey. That was done in the 1980s, where folks, a cast of characters went around documenting the older buildings that were still surviving in Dutchess County, and often making notations based off of older maps, the 1876 map, the 1867 maps, to talk about what was here that is no longer here. We have some of that material in the Department of Planning, which is, if we have it, it has been scanned and is accessible via that historical resources inventory interface. The Dutchess County Historical Society has other material on that, and I believe is intending to receive even more material on that. But it's also a great thing to go to your local historical society and ask some questions there, do some Google searching, but it is a lengthy and intensive process to put together a property history.
Yeah, it sounds like there are a lot of resources out there. And funny and sort of funny and ironic how much of it is so high tech and digital that digs so deep into the past where no one could possibly have imagined computers and what they can do.
Yeah.
So the next question is asking about if there's any history of charcoal making or leather tanning in Dutchess County. And this is something I was wondering about as well, because as an ecologist, I tend to focus a lot on those industries that caused an enormous amount of
Hmm.
tree clearing. And I know both of those industries did that to a great extent in our area.
Well, in terms of a written history of either one of those things, there is an excellent series of books, and the name of the author escapes me, but that have been written from folks based right across the border in Connecticut on the history of the iron industry. But because, of course, like everything else, natural resources did not respect lines drawn by European guys on a map. So you find the iron mines, the kilns, the foundries on both sides of that border between New England and New York. But God, charcoal creation 100% denuded Eastern Dutchess. It was one of the contributing factors to the movement of the iron industry out of Eastern Dutchess in the early 20th century and to point south. And by no coincidence, Pennsylvania, where they have access to rich coal beds. Because as you can see, if you go to visit the charcoal kilns at Wassaic today, these are major operations to make enough charcoal and the right quality of charcoal to get high enough heat to refine iron. You're denuding the entirety of Eastern Dutchess. And if you search for Wassaic, you'll find a beautiful website. On Wassaic, they have some historic postcard views, and you can see that early 20th century Wassaic and southern Armenia compared to now, treeless. They have denuded all of those mountains of everything they can cut down. They've gone north and south in the Harlem Valley to try to find this stuff. And as they run out of it, that's the death knell of the iron industry, because you don't have coal-rich deposits around here, which is probably a good thing for us now. And you can't get enough trees to keep the furnaces going, so you have to say goodbye to that industry. But that's a land use that has significant impacts on forestation. Leatherworking, there were tanneries in colonial and early Republic Dutchess, but it very quickly becomes a point where not only is that very costly in terms of natural resources, as Julie has pointed out, the deforestation, it also smells terrible. You do not want a tannery within smelling distance of your home. And so these things from the beginning of the colonial period are put way outside the limits of settlement. And as settlement grows, they have less and less land to do that stuff on. And finally, it just becomes cheaper to bring it in from elsewhere.
Cool, thank you. Two interesting topics and tied directly to land use for sure. So the next question is coming in is asking, are you seeing a difference in land use in the Rombout patent where Madame Brett sold land from the beginning in other patents, such as the Beekman, which was kept as tenant property much longer?
Well, that is a beautiful and sophisticated question. Thank you for it. And of course, I'm buttering you up to tell you that I have not delved deeply into the Rombout patent to be able to answer these questions, but it is one of those places, and I couldn't say whether this is related to Madame Brett or not, but a very early diversification of land use, because of course that becomes one of the centers for the brick industry with all the clay deposits along the river. You do have the agriculture, some of which survives till today. You have a weird period in like the 1840s where various investors are trying to capture swamp gas to sell as a means of fuel. And we theoretically have some cases about that in the ancient documents, but in the unprocessed portion of the collection. So I can't really say whether or not Madame Brett's practices early on have an impact on the subsequent development, but it's a very interesting place to look at for land use. And of course, Beacon, and if there are any Beaconites here tonight, my apologies for not mentioning this earlier, is also a very early industrial area, including the hat business, for which they remain known throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, but that's a high density factory area.
All right, we actually have someone who typed in the location of that toll house.
I'm going
This
to
is
write this
on
down.
Old Route 55, just south of the intersection of 292. So thank you, Brad, for bringing that information to light. And we have a couple of questions about the patent maps. So there's a question asking if the original patent map still exists for Dutchess County besides that roundabout patent map that you showed. And there's kind of a follow-up question asking who were the 9 partners, which I think is something that's on a lot of people's minds at times like this.
Oh my goodness. Well, I would have needed a cheat sheet to answer the who were the 9 partners question, because there are 2 sets of 9 partners. There are the great 9 partners of the 1690s, and that's all of Central Dutchess. And then there are the little 9 partners, not because they were tiny guys, but because the patent was smaller, of 1706. There are some of the same cast of characters involved in both in terms of the actual same guys, but there are also some who are involved in the Great 9 Partners who are not still doing the land speculating thing for the Little 9 Partners, because dividing up the Great 9 Partners patent was a tremendous headache due to the fact that they sat in a comfortable room in New York City and drew lines on a map and then said, John Sackett, you're our guy, go up there and make this work somehow. And that's how, like in the Little 9 Partners, you end up with a couple of lots being a mountain, not great for either mining of iron or for cultivation. But yeah, so in terms of who the 9 partners were, I would look at Hasbrook's History of Dutchess County from 1914. If I recall correctly, he was a judge. He's far more reliable than Smith, who wrote the more famous 1880s history. And Hasbrook's history is available for free online, I think, at archives.org. But just type up Hasbrook History of Dutchess County. He goes into some of that. In terms of, what was the other part of the question, Julie? Oh, the patent maps themselves. We have the Little 9 Partners map here because it was filed here. Because by the 1740s, they had figured out, you know what, it's probably a good thing to give some of this stuff to the county clerk to take care of because he has to keep it. We do have filed maps from the 18th century of other parts of, say, the 9 Partners patent, but we do not have a complete and total lot map of these things. They have been reconstructed from various other sources, but to my knowledge, there is not currently known a map that we could, for example, georeference, which would be the ideal of each of these patents onto the land. And to a large extent, the actual, they were writing these boundaries down based on what they understood them to be. Again, Great 9 Partners not surveyed until after the map is made. Rombout, not entirely sure, haven't gone into it in detail. But these patent boundaries are very vague, and this is why it takes into the 1740s, 1750s to actually get people technically, legally, documentably settled on the land. It is a huge mess. It's one that I plan to look into in a more detailed fashion. I'm really hoping the county clerk might, ideally send me to London for a couple of weeks to dig through the old Board of Trade and Colonial Office files. Maybe more likely I'll be able to order some copies of material from London, but this is going to take going back to the files surviving from the 17th and early 18th centuries to try to begin to unravel. And it's going to be an additional headache because of those failed patents, because it wasn't just enough to bring a piece of paper that some native sachems had marked on. No, there were many who tried and did not get past the governor and council's test on that, especially out in Eastern Dutchess. So it's a very complicated story. It's going to take a while to unravel.
Well, we'll put in a good word with the county clerk for you to get that trip on the docket for you, Will.
Thank you.
Of course. The next question I enjoyed because I love driving around and looking at the names of roads and towns and thinking if they have a Dutch colonization history or a Native American history or whatnot. Where did the name Salt Point come from?
I don't know that one off the top of my head, and I always, again, want to stay to the documentation I know, because there are already enough stories out there that are not necessarily based in hard and fast documentation. But initially, a lot of the names of these roads, not the ones they per se bear today, but they're ones as you're looking back in time are about where they go to or where they come from. If we were to, for example, jump back to that map of Beekman from 1797, if you zoom into the roads, a lot of them are labeled, you know, road to X, road from Y. Earlier in the 18th century, you have such great names as the Great Road, the South Road, the Post Road, because initially these things grow up as roads that are built from point A to point B, and normally from one person's house to another person's house. These people technically being local municipal officers called overseers of highways or overseers of roads or road supervisors. They're the ones responsible for laying out the roads, which is no mean feat. You know, if you don't have a Caterpillar or a dump truck or all of the other machinery we take for granted today, laying them out is a real problem. Keeping them open is a problem, because in the 18th century, especially before the Revolution, farmers like to build fences and put obstacles across roads because they don't like roads going through their farms. It's a real mess. So you're really talking about the late 19th century into the mid 20th century for the formal naming of a lot of these roads. Much of that naming is done at the municipal level by the predecessors of the town departments of works, and the cities and villages by the municipal authorities. For example, if you look at the minutes for the village of Poughkeepsie, the predecessor of the city of Poughkeepsie, there's a lot of discussion in them in the 1820s and into the 1830s about what are we going to name all of these streets that we are building in the city. And I don't think it's a heck of a lot of coincidence that initially they're like, let's name them after great Americans like Washington, or let's name them after what we want to happen on them like Market. But then let's name it after the real estate scam that we're running, like Mansion Street. Yeah, just imagine that you can come here and build mansions. And then finally they start naming these streets and roads after themselves. So that, like landscape history, is a whole another set of questions and research that is super duper extremely local.
Yeah, I've always thought it's really fascinating, the stories that you can read in just a road map. And driving around here, and there's Sawmill Lane, and there's Gristmill Lane, and there's Mill Street, and Mill Lane, and Mill everything you can imagine, and Creamery Lane. And you can really see the history of the land and the names of the roads. And now I know where Starborough Road got its name too.
And of course land use, because it's Mill Street because it took you to the mill.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, the layers of history that we can find just in a regular road map.
Yeah, and if you're ever having a really frustrating experience driving on one of the secondary roads of Dutchess County, and you ask yourself, why does this road have no passing places? Why is it so twisty and turny? The answer is probably that it is an 18th century road underneath all of that modern development. They tried to straighten them as much as they could in the 1930s, but that was not always possible.
Yes. And we did have someone write in with a comment on the Salt Point question, saying there's various theories for that name. And most of them are about cattle drivers salting the cattle as they stop to give them a drink before heading into Poughkeepsie for sale. And the cows would drink more and then they would weigh more. I've heard that story quite a bit too.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question, I think this is sort of asking how consistent land use history is throughout the Northeast. They're asking, do you think your basic overall observations are replicated in other areas, for example, within the Chesapeake Bay estuary and watershed?
I am the Dutchess County historian, so I am not going to walk out onto the gangplank of making even more generalized statements than I already have. I would actually kick this back to the Land Conservancy and say that everything depends on the specific constellation of natural resources that exist in a landscape, as well as terrain features. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is a very different place than what we have here in Dutchess County between the Harlem Valley and the Hudson Valley and all of the various ranges of mountains. So, I mean, there will be, to a point, if you pull the level of focus out enough, this relationship between the extremes of agriculture and industry. But in terms of the details, that is all borne out by extremely ultra-local conditions, because before the mid-20th century, you're still talking about what today we would consider very isolated communities that essentially have everything they need in what today is a hamlet. And it's a whole different, like, we have more population in Dutchess County today than we did in 1850, but more areas of Dutchess County were settled, I would at least make the argument, in 1850 than were today, which is why you can go to places like Milan and the northern part of Red Hook and see these relatively well-preserved landscapes, because there were people up there and then they left, in part because of things like IBM, which caused concentration of settlements in very specific areas, and as a result, destroyed those remnants, those palimpsests of previous land use and occupation, in order to satisfy the needs of the modern world.
The ebb and flow of resources and the ebb and flow of migration.
Absolutely.
Cool. I like that question. I like that answer. The next question coming in, when were the patents granted for the oblong, and how did people become patentees for the land in the oblong?
Oh, God. Did Ed Downey ask that question? No, he didn't. But I'm sure Ed Downey is clapping, whoever he is. The oblong is its own twisted ball of yarn to untwist. We do not have a copy of the Treaty of Dover, as far as I can tell, extant within the state of New York, which was the agreement between New York and Connecticut that resulted in that land being ceded to New York due to the catastrophic 1911 New York Capitol fire, which is the reason why you have a county historian today, because everything that had been centralized and stored in Albany went up in flames, including a copy of that treaty, probably. I've tried without success to get a copy of it out of Connecticut, and I've recently been tipped off by one of our veteran title searchers here that the arguments over that border, which continue today, if any of you happen to have property that actually crosses that border, you probably have noticed that every now and again, the taxes you pay to Connecticut and New York change because the border is adjusted from time to time. There's evidently a big long packet of paper in the Library of Congress from the 1920s when New York and Connecticut were arguing again about where that border was, because it had been long enough for them to forget about where they put all of the border markers the last time they marked the border. And I'm told that there is a copy of the Treaty of Dover in there, but I effectively, to get back around to answering the question, I do not currently have the documentation on hand to even begin approaching that. But if you want to write to Dutchess County Clerk Brad Kendall and encourage him to send me to the British Imperial Archives at Kew for anywhere between 3 and 6 weeks, ought to be sufficient. Maybe June, maybe July. We can straighten this out for you, potentially.
There are always a lot of questions about the oblong. I love looking at the old maps. It's something that I think there's a lot more folks that know about it and understand the history of it, but it's a twisted ball of yarn, like you said. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Now we have a question that's referencing someone that I presume is a Dutchess County historian. John Kading used to gather lots of photos and materials on the history of Dutchess, and this person is wondering if that material is accessible.
I am not sure if it's the John Kading that I am thinking of. He was based out of Millbrook, and I believe the Millbrook Society has some of his materials. I do not know if they have all of his materials. I know that most of what I've heard about John's work in terms of the discussion of preserving it and granting access has been about his photograph collection, which is a significant resource for understanding the history of the town of Washington, Millbrook, and all the other places John got to. But I'm not sure enough to make any statements about what the situation is with disposition of the entirety of that collection.
Okay, so maybe this person could start with the Millbrook Historical Society and see where that leads.
Absolutely, yeah, reach out to them. They're very responsive to their email. They've got a great website, so.
Cool. Yeah, take advantage of the resources you have, right? People like questions who are in the profession of answering them for people. So this question, I believe, was kind of addressed during the presentation, but probably some fill in the blanks. What original patents exist beside the Rombout patent?
Okay, hi Tony Houston. That's one of two that I'm aware of that are here. The other being the Little Nine Partners patent. There's a copy of that up in Pine Plains held by the Little Nine Partners Historical Society. And I say that answer very specifically because the survival of resources in terms of historical documentation in Dutchess County is just mind-blowing. It is exceptional. It is not what is supposed to happen because the history profession, the professors and other folks tend to just look at the major professional archives that are in coastal cities. They don't come out to rural contexts, which Dutchess technically is for most of its history. So I have been looking through the collections of the various historical societies, not all of them, just a handful of them over the past, believe it or not, 12 years that I've been here. And during COVID, we began a process of making this material accessible through the archival imaging initiative, the brainchild of our county clerk. Well, I'm sure we'll be generous with travel funds in next year's budget. But as a result of this, we've gone into local historical societies. We found all sorts of material that no historians would ever have really suspected had existed, all the way back to the 18th century, just mountains and mountains of documentation. We haven't run across any other copies of patents yet. I would not be surprised if some of them popped out of a laundry room, which a strange number of these items seem to come out of. They go from the laundry room to the historical society. Some of them still pop up at dumps, believe it or not. A lot of extremely valuable early documentation has been rescued from municipal dumps, or they're in attics, basements, hidden behind walls. Who knows? There may be more copies here, but I only know of those two, which is why I have to go to London.
Sounds like maybe you should check the laundry room first before you buy your plane ticket.
Yeah.
Now, here's an interesting question about surveys and maps. Are there any surveys that identify and map archaeological sites of indigenous peoples' activities and the early industrial and agricultural landscape of Dutchess County?
So what you're talking about there is a combo of agricultural and historical, or oftentimes called cultural resources survey. We have the historical resources survey from the 1980s, which document primarily settlement sites of Europeans. They sometimes document, excuse me, industrial sites. We do have some filed maps here in the county clerk's office that have notations that one could liberally interpret as potentially marking native settlement sites. And I am aware of some municipalities that have resource maps documenting archaeological sites, which is generally kept under lock and key because the moment that information gets out, those sites become a target for folks who want to get the material remains of the past out of them. So that is really not on the radar of public accessibility at this juncture. But the long and the short of it is, no, we do not have comprehensive maps of where these sites and cultural and historical and industrial resources are. We have that information scattered in various and sundry places, but I do not, unfortunately, have a magical file drawer that I can open up and produce a map that shows where all this stuff is. But if you look at Stephanie Mowry's maps, the late Stephanie Mowry's maps that are part of the historical resources inventory that is accessible through Parcel Access and a couple of other places on the Dutchess County website. So if you go to dutchessny.gov and search for historical resources inventory, that should pop up. You will see that she will make note or has made notations on some of those maps calling out where other cultural resources are located or roughly on a given spot.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are treasure hunters out there that don't want to put these things on maps to kind of showcase where these things are. So the last thing coming in, I think, is the perfect way to close the night. So if the county historian has enough vacation time, he's welcome to spend it in England, but what a bravura performance.
That's the boss. Thank you, Brad.
And I agree with that closing statement that Brad made there. We'll keep putting in the good word for you, Will, but definitely your performance tonight speaks volumes to your accomplishments here in Dutchess County, and we just really appreciate you giving this talk tonight. It's been really interesting, and I'm sure people will be directing people to this chat for time to come. So thank you for your availability tonight. We appreciate it. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone for attending tonight. We'll be back in a month from now. We will be sending out a follow-up email with a lot of the resources that Will mentioned in his chat tonight. And we'll probably be reaching out to you, Will, for some of those resources as well. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Will, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Will.
Good night.
Thank you all. Take care. Good night.